Good evening and welcome to the first Global Briefing Series of 2021. Sorry for the delay this afternoon, but we're happy that you have joined us for this very important Global Briefing Series. My name is Jamie Fullerton, and I'm the Director of the Academic Programs in the School of Global Studies at Oklahoma State University. The School of Global Studies and Partnerships at OSU hosts 3 events per semester designed to highlight important international issues. We see this as part of our mission as a flagship university to bring important issues to our students and the citizens of our state and the world. Since the pandemic, we've been holding our briefing series virtually as we're doing today. I would like to thank the staff at O State TV for their great support. They worked so hard in helping us deliver these talks for our viewers. I also would like to recognize our co-sponsors for today's event, Phi Beta Delta, the International Honor Society for Global Scholars, and UPAEP, our partner university in Puebla, Mexico. Today's speaker is Mr. Simon Anholt. Simon is an independent policy advisor based in London. He has advised many heads of state and governments on how to improve their reputations and standing on the international stage. Simon is also a prolific author who has written 6 books, all of which appear on my students' reading list every semester in the public diplomacy course. Additionally, Simon publishes the Good Country Index, which ranks countries on their contributions to humanity and the planet, and is now in its 5th edition. He also publishes the Anholt Ipsos Nation Brand Index, which since 2004 has collected more than 1 billion data points tracking public perceptions of countries. Simon's TED Talk launching the Good Country Index has received over 7 million views on TED.com and another 5 million on YouTube. If you haven't seen his 2014 TED Talk, I encourage you to do so. Simon's latest book, The Good Country Index, is his formula for empowering governments and future generations to collaborate. It is the latest book, which I just finished reading and found it to be excellent. That is today's topic for today's session. I've known Simon professionally and followed his important work for many years, so I'm especially thrilled to have him here with us this afternoon. Simon, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jamie. It's a real pleasure.
Well, Simon, I would like you to tell us about your new book and share with us the latest work that you're doing. You've been in this business for 20 years, so we're ready to hear from you.
There's plenty to say, Jamie. Thank you. I'm going to try and keep my initial remarks down to about 30 minutes so that we'll have some time to discuss afterwards, and so you can put some questions to me. But let me try and summarize what the book says in half an hour, which I think is probably doable. The reason I wanted to write this book, The Good Country Equation, was because after doing, as you said, the job that I'd been doing for 20 years, traveling around the world advising the presidents and prime ministers and occasionally monarchs of getting on for 60 countries, I kind of suddenly realized that there were only 2 things wrong with the world. And 2 may seem like a small number because these days we are so deeply accustomed to hearing enormous, terrifying lists of things that are wrong with the world. Starting from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, 17 reasons to wake up in the morning feeling incredibly depressed, and the long, long lists that we seem to hear all the time, from climate change and pandemics, right the way through to abuses of human rights, migration, poverty, species loss, and all the rest of it. These are all serious issues, and it may seem completely overwhelming at times. It does to me as well sometimes. And you think to yourself, how can we ever defeat all of these simultaneous challenges? It sometimes seems as if in the modern age, the biggest problem we face is the fact that our solutions have been much less effectively globalized than our problems, because all of those problems are very thoroughly global. Climate change and pandemic being the very obvious examples. They're just everywhere. And even if you succeed in pushing them down in one country or one territory, all that happens is they just pop up in another. And people have started saying quite a lot recently about the pandemic, that it ain't over until it's over everywhere. And there's simply no point in one country being able to suppress the virus in its own territory because this is a globalized world. And within a very short space of time, it will respread again. But the same is true of all of the global challenges. They're all like a big global game of whack-a-mole. As soon as you tamp it down somewhere, it pushes up somewhere else. And where are our solutions? Well, it's strange, you see, because the solutions, as I said, just aren't as effectively globalized as the problems. It's not that we don't have solutions. And this is one of the curious things that I began to learn over the 20 years or so as I was traveling around the planet advising all of these governments. Because what always happened was that I would sit down with government officials and very often with some experts on the challenges that that country was facing. And they would tell me about their problems. And I would begin to realize that it was the same list of problems I'd heard in every other single country I'd ever visited. And I began to realize that it had been years since I last heard of a national problem anywhere in the world that I'd never heard of anywhere else. And I began to realize truly this is one set of problems that every country is suffering from. So the conversation would kind of go like this. I'd say to the expert, who was often not just a national expert, but sometimes even a global expert on whatever the challenge is, say climate change. And I'd say, do we know the solution to this problem if it's causing you such a challenge? And they would say, oh yeah, we know the solution. We know what we need to do. We know what we need to do to prevent or mitigate climate change. We know what we need to do in order to make migration less of a problem. We know what we need to do in order to prevent conflict. And so I would say to them, well, if you know the solution, why don't you implement it? And they would say, oh, well, we don't have the resources. You see, this challenge is bigger than our country, and we simply don't have the resources to tackle it. And that struck me as being rather interesting. So I would say to them, well, in that case, surely you need to team up with some other countries so that collectively you do have the resources to tackle this problem. And that's the point where they'd smile sadly at me and they'd say, oh, if only we could get them to collaborate. But the years that we have in office, in power, this government, are just not enough for us to get collaboration and cooperation properly on board with other states and other territories and other players in the international system. And so that was the point where I began to realize that actually you can indeed, if you want to, list 35 or 40 grand challenges and think that we're overwhelmed. But equally, you could see those challenges as just symptoms of a much more serious and in many ways much simpler underlying problem, which is the problem of the culture of governance. That nation states collectively do have the power to fix these problems, but they don't because they don't cooperate and they don't collaborate nearly enough, nearly enthusiastically enough, nearly bravely, courageously, innovatively enough. They tend to collaborate when they absolutely have no other choice, and they do it very late and very poorly and often very briefly, and it's not enough to really fix the problems. So it began to occur to me that actually, really, there's just one problem here, and that is that the fundamental culture of governance worldwide is competitive, and it needs to be collaborative. All of the nation states, ever since the nation state came into being at the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, if you happen to believe that version, or perhaps many, many centuries earlier, the culture of the nation state has always been one of achieving ascendancy over other nation states. Back in the old days, in the age of conflict, it was always about stealing their territory and killing their people and stealing their treasure. And then after the end of the Second World War, we went into a longer, blessedly more peaceful period, what you might call the age of competition, where for the most part, we substituted armed warfare for competitiveness, economic, trade competition. It's still basically all about countries trying to achieve ascendancy over each other, but on the whole, it's less bloody. But this is no good, because in the end, we're still competing. In the end, we're still keeping knowledge from each other. In the end, we're still fixated on defeating the others, on getting there first, on somehow coming first in this imaginary global race that says you have to be America first, or Germany first, or Japan first. I wasn't in the tiniest bit surprised or even upset or outraged when President Trump first started talking about America first. It struck me as being a statement of the obvious. If you're voted in to represent the interests of your people, of course you put their interests first. That's obvious. That's primarily that's the main job of a head of state or a head of government. But where I would have loved to have had an argument with President Trump, and it's probably too late now on that particular topic, is Why does America coming first mean that every other country has to come last? Because America, of all countries, possibly has tried hardest over the years to demonstrate that you can come first, whilst assisting other countries to do as well as they can too. This is a principle which is well known in industry. I think the auto industry, way back in the 1970s, imported from Japan an idea which was called co-opetition. The idea that you cooperate and you collaborate and you compete all at the same time. And you can work together with your competitors to boost the entire marketplace. But you can still compete and you can still come first. Because you see, I don't really have a problem with competition. Competition is a natural instinct of humanity. It's lifted billions of people out of poverty over the decades. We wouldn't be humans without it. It's only a problem when it becomes the only altar at which we worship, and that has increasingly been the case globally over the past decades. So a change in the culture of governance from fundamentally competitive to fundamentally collaborative, where you collaborate first by instinct and then compete on top of that, that I think is where we need to get to if we're going to resolve the global challenges. So you're probably feeling pretty puzzled at the moment because I started off by saying that there were really only two things wrong with the world, and I've just said there's one thing wrong with the world. The one thing that's wrong with the world is the way that countries behave, but there's another thing, and that is the way that people behave. Because the other remarkable thing about those 40 or so grand challenges, the other thing that they all have in common, every single one of them, is that they're all caused by human beings. They're all caused by the way that we behave, and they're perpetrated by the way that we behave, and they're prolonged by the way that we behave. And so if we want to fix the world, if we want to make things work better, we need to fix two things. We need to fix the way that countries behave, and we need to fix the way that people behave. So I don't have time now to talk about both of those because both of those are big subjects in their own right. But let me focus on the first one. Let me focus on the way that countries behave. Now, Dr. Fullerton mentioned in her introduction that I run a survey called the Anholt Ipsos Nation Brands Index. And this is a study which measures popular international perceptions of countries, of 50 different countries. And every year since 2005, I and my colleagues now at Ipsos Mori, a big international research company, have polled about 20,000 people around the world, asking them in great detail their perceptions of 50 different countries. Now, you might well say, what do perceptions matter? Surely the reality is what's important. Well, no, perceptions do matter because they're fundamentally what drive people to behave the way that they do. The reason why I'm fond of buying Japanese products is because of what I believe about Japan and what I believe about their products and their engineering expertise and their design capability and all the rest of it. It's not necessarily based on knowledge. It's mainly based on beliefs. And that's inevitable because there are so many countries out there, more than 200 last time I checked, that none of us, not even specialist internationalists, can really know all that much about many of those countries. So most of us, in the end, just make do with a simple childish stereotype that we have tucked away at the back of our mind somewhere about what kind of country France is, or what kind of country Sweden or Cambodia or Eritrea or Paraguay is. And we use those shortcuts to navigate through an incredibly complex world. And we hardly ever reassess them, and we hardly ever change them. This is why, back in the 1990s, when I first started writing about these issues, I compared them to the brand images of companies and corporations. In the same way that we don't really know how our Nike trainers are manufactured, we don't really understand the technology of our Chevrolet car, if we're lucky. We do know that we think we can trust the brand that makes them. We trust them to know about these things. And we trust the company that makes them, and we trust the country that the company comes from. And it's the same with countries. We have a little cliche in our head, let's call it a brand image, and we navigate according to that brand image. And so the Nation Brands Index, which I started running back in 2005, has been annual ever since. And it's really fascinating to discover in reality how people perceive other countries. Most of the time, they don't really think about other countries. The vast majority of people in the world don't actually think about more than 3 foreign countries on the whole. They think about their own country a little bit, not a lot, unless it happens to be particularly contested at that particular moment. They think about a very large and very significant country that they believe has an impact on the world that they live in. This is very often the United States, or it could be China if you live in Asia. And then a third country, which is just important to them for some personal reason, because you know, their sister is going to study there, or because they'd like to go on holiday there, or something like that. That's it, 3 countries. Now, as I said, there are around about 205, depending on how you count them. So what that effectively means is that for the majority of the world's population, most of the time, to all intents and purposes, 202 countries just don't exist. We never think about them. We never reassess, as I said, those perceptions we have of them. And so those images become incredibly important. So by the time we got to 2012, I realized that the database of the Nation Brands Index had swelled to an enormous size. And this is what happens if you do regular international polling. Lots of questions, big questionnaire, asking people about lots of different countries. You do end up with an enormous amount of data. 2012 came around and I discovered that I'd collected more than 1 billion data points. So this was officially big data. And I was absolutely convinced that within that database lay the secrets of the universe. Because whenever I poked my fingers into that database, I found extraordinary things that I would never have suspected about how the world sees the world. And at this point in 2012, I really only had one question that I wanted to ask that great big database. It seemed to me to be the most important question of all. Why do people admire country A more than country B? Because year after year after year, they certainly do. And it doesn't really change very much. I've often said that the Nation Brands Index is the world's most boring social survey for the simple reason that it rarely changes from year to year. Almost nobody ever changes their minds about other countries. I suppose, because if every time a country behaved out of character or lost a football game or took in some refugees or had a terrorist attack, if every time one of those things happened, we reassessed our view of that country, well, frankly, we'd have no time left to do anything else. We'd be constantly reassessing our views of other countries and we wouldn't have time to eat or sleep. So what we do with those images is we put them in the back of our minds in safe cold storage, and we simply never change them. This is a problem for governments because very many countries have got images that are not very useful to them. They're a bit negative. They're a bit out of date. They're a bit vacant. They're a bit unfair. They're a bit empty compared to the rich reality of most nations. And most governments, and indeed most populations, would like nothing better than to have a reputation that was more in tune with the reality of who they truly are, more up to date, more useful to their aims and ambitions and aspirations. But they don't have it. We all have to make do with these childish cliches, and there seems to be very little we can do to change them. And are they important? Yes, they certainly are important. Because quite simply, a country with a powerful and positive image trades at a premium. If you've got a wonderful image like Sweden or Switzerland, everything you do is easy and everything you do is cheap. Whether it's a question of attracting talented individuals to come and live and work in your country, whether it's a question of exporting your products and your services and selling them at a healthy margin, whether it's a question of attracting foreign investment, which is so essential for the economy, attracting tourists, likewise. If you've got a good image, all of that is easy and relatively cheap. If, on the other hand, your country has a weak or a negative image, nobody's ever heard of you, or they've got bad ideas about you, everything is difficult and everything is expensive. You're constantly having to justify yourself to other people. You're constantly having to explain and say it's not as bad as you think. Or we do deserve to be better regarded than we are. And by the time you finish saying that, they've wandered off and you've lost their attention. In fact, national images are so very, very important that they're one of the main reasons why there's so much and indeed increasing inequality in the world. Because poor countries not only have to cope with weak infrastructure and weak economies and weak systems, they also have to cope, they have to struggle against the constant headwind of a negative reputation, people not wanting to believe anything good of them. And thus, the poor countries stay poor or get poorer, and the rich countries stay rich or get richer. And this is also driven by image. So that's why, to pick up the thread of the story again, back in 2012, I really only had one question for that huge database, which is, why do people admire country A more than country B? I knew it was nothing to do with propaganda. I knew it was nothing to do with the increasingly prevalent trend for governments to spend horrific, obscene amounts of taxpayers' money on trying to boost their images. Governments by this stage were spending tens of millions, sometimes even hundreds of millions of dollars on PR campaigns and advertising campaigns and logos and slogans, all of the paraphernalia of marketing communications from the private sector, in the mistaken belief that this would somehow improve their image, that people would somehow look at an advertisement and say, oh my goodness, I've been wrong about that country all my life. I will immediately change my mind. It doesn't happen. Propaganda, let's call it by its proper name, from foreign governments telling you to change your mind about their country is universally and quite rightly and quite understandably ignored by the majority of people. We're not stupid. We know what that message is saying. It's saying you will change your mind about this country, and therefore we ignore it. It means nothing to us whatsoever. So it's not propaganda. It's nothing to do, it doesn't correlate to the smallest degree with how much money a country spends on trying to make itself look good. So what does it depend on? Well, cut a long story short, what I discovered through analyzing the database of the Nation Brands Index was that there are about 5 drivers of a positive national image and all the benefits that that brings. And 4 of them are kind of what you'd expect. They're things like what Joseph Nye calls hard power. If you have a big army, a big economy, a big population, a big land area, then you count. And people therefore regard you with a certain amount of respect, admiration, perhaps even liking, just because you're powerful, because you're important, because you have the power to change the world that they live in. Beauty is important. Those of us who are sighted tend to assume a great many things about people and places depending on how good they look. So that's important. If countries have got beautiful landscapes, beautiful national costume, if they design beautiful buildings and cars and products, then again, that makes people think that they must be a pretty cool place. But out of all of those 5, by a wide margin, the most significant driver of a positive national image turned out to be the least expected one, at least as far as I was concerned. It was the perception that this country, whichever country it is, contributes to the world outside its own borders. So nothing to do with how well you manage your own people or your own territory, nothing to do with how rich or famous or beautiful or technologically advanced you are, but everything to do with what you do for the whole of humanity and the whole of the planet. And if you think about it, it's not so surprising that that's actually what people care about most. Because what you do inside your own country, if I don't live there and I'm not a citizen of that country, has no relevance to me, really. I might be curious about it, but it's not going to change my life. If the government of Guatemala or Greenland or Gabon starts spending $100 million a year from next year, bragging about how extraordinary they are and their beautiful landscapes and their wonderful school system and their amazingly buoyant economy and all the rest of it, the most I'm going to say is, well, good for you. I wish my country was doing that well. But in the end, it's not going to make me change my mind about that country. I'll forget it as soon as I've learned it because it has no impact on me. It's not part of my life. It's not relevant to what I think about. But if, on the other hand, one or more of those countries appear in my frame of reference doing something for the whole planet, doing something for all of mankind, then I'm interested. Because then I start to think to myself, I'm pretty glad that Gabon or Guatemala exists. I'm pretty glad they're there because they're making the world that I live in a better place for me, for my children, for my grandchildren, and so forth. And so ultimately, it turned out that by a very wide margin, the most significant and most powerful driver of a positive national image is the perception that you are a good country. Good, the opposite of selfish, not good, the opposite of bad. I know what a bad country is. I wouldn't want to pass judgment like that on any country. But a selfish country is one that focuses entirely on its own population and entirely on its own slice of territory. And so a thought occurred to me. People in positions of power and authority ever since the beginning of history have had a single, simple mandate. That is, America first, to look after their own people and their own slice of territory. And if in order to achieve that, they end up harming other people or other parts of the planet or the atmosphere above it, that's just fine, that's fine. Because those other countries can look after themselves, right? And the planet can look after itself, right? Not so right. Today, everybody in a position of power and authority has a double mandate, a dual mandate. They are responsible for their own people, yes, but also, to some extent, for every man, woman, child, and animal on the planet, whether they like it or not. They are responsible for their own slice of territory, absolutely, but also, to some extent, for every square inch of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it and the ground beneath their feet, whether they like it or not. And if they don't like it, they shouldn't be in a position of power or responsibility because those are the rules of good governance in the 21st century. And that's what I call the dual mandate. And that, it seems to me, is the new rule for life on Earth. The gold standard of good governance in the 21st century is the ability to harmonize your domestic and your international responsibilities. So whatever you do as a policymaker or as any person in a position of power or authority is you do the right thing for your own people whilst doing no harm and preferably doing good to people elsewhere. And if every country on earth, every territory, every city, every region on earth did that, and it was their principle of governance, then the world would be a much more peaceful, much more successful, much more equal, and generally better place to live than it is at the moment. It's precisely because we've allowed ourselves to be driven by self-interested national competition, nation against nation, city against city, tribe against tribe, that we've gotten ourselves into the mess that we're in today. So it was at this point that I thought to myself, how interesting that people seem to know, they have such a strong sense of which countries are good and which countries are selfish. Because this was the week where the Prime Minister of Great Britain, where I live, David Cameron, I remember he told us all on Monday, the whole population, that we should be extremely grateful for China because China was going to rescue the UK's nuclear power industry. And then on Friday, he told us that we should despise and fear China because it was a serial abuser of human rights within its own territory. And I remember thinking at the time, now I'm confused, and this is supposed to be my subject. We must be all very confused. How do we know whether China's a good country or not a good country? How do we know whether any country, including our own, is more good or more selfish? How do we know whether it looks more inwards or more outwards? Because countries are complicated things. They're not just one thing, they're many things. They're all contradictions. Every country is full of them. Every government is full of them. So wouldn't it be interesting to actually try and systematically measure that? So that was when the Good Country Index came into being. I decided that what I would try to do was to do basically a composite index using all of the good data I could find about how much countries actually contribute measurably to the world outside their borders and how much they take away from humanity and the planet. How much of the world's capital do they spend, and by how much do they expand it through their behaviors day to day, week to week, year to year. A kind of balance sheet for humanity, if you like. So you can measure the pro and the con. And that's the Good Country Index. And I released the first edition in 2014. I've pretty much managed to publish an edition every year since then, and it's always been highly controversial. Indexes, rankings of countries are always controversial because everybody on the planet seems to have a country they love and a country they hate, and they feel rather militant about it. And so I get thousands of emails all the time from people saying, why the hell did you put the country I hate so high? Or why the hell did you put the country I love so low? But I don't put them anywhere. It's just what the data tells me. And if you do that composition of 35 big data sets from the UN system and from other international providers, and you crunch them all together, it's very simple. There's no trick arithmetic in there. You just basically compile all of those rankings, and what you end up with is an overview, a massively simplified and massively reduced overview, nonetheless an overview, which helps you to answer the question, should I feel glad as a human being that country X exists? Does it deserve its place in the community of nations, or is it a free rider on all of us, taking advantage of our relative generosity or our goodwill? Now, I say generosity, but one thing I should clarify. This has really got very little to do with the old-fashioned idea of rich countries giving money to poor countries. That still goes on. It still needs to go on. Economic aid is essential from time to time and in many circumstances. But it's not the thing I'm mainly measuring in the Good Country Index, because I think that old idea that the good countries are the rich countries because they give spare cash to the poor countries, I think that's very, very inadequate. I think it's a hopelessly primitive way of looking at the international community. I personally think that all countries have to get to the stage where they feel an equal responsibility to drive this planet forward through outer space. Otherwise, we're all really, really in trouble. And so I measure the financial parts as little as I possibly can. Very, very few of those 35 indicators are directly about money. And as a result of doing that fairly effectively, one of the great results was that in the first edition of the Good Country Index in 2014, Kenya, a country with a very small economy, managed to come in the top 30 overall of the goodest countries. I say goodest because I don't want to say best. Best sounds like a value judgment, which is a different thing. And this is very, very good news because, as I say, Kenya is by most conventional accounts a poor country. And yet, through the way that it behaves and the way that it makes use of the international system and the factors that are available to all countries today in the international community, it is a good international citizen. Even receiving money through aid is a way of engaging with the international system and making use of that. You don't have to be a donor. So that's the Good Country Index. And it's turned out to be, as I say, quite a controversial thing. But I keep it going every year because I love the arguments that it generates. And at the end of those arguments, I always find myself saying the same thing to the person who's attacked me for putting America too low or putting Germany too high or whatever it is. I say, look, we may not agree on whether that's the right position for America or Germany. We may disagree forever and ever and ever about whether I'm using the right statistics and whether I'm using them in the right way. But in the end, what you can't deny is that we've just had a different kind of conversation about countries and what they're for. Instead of doing what you tend to do when you look at all the other country rankings, the GDP and the GNI and all the rest of it, we're suddenly not having an argument about how well this country is doing. We're having a totally different argument about how much this country is doing. And based on what I said a little bit earlier about the dual mandate, about the importance of countries working together if we're going to fight off these grand challenges, that is surely the more important question today. Not how well are you doing, but how much are you doing? Should I feel glad that you as a country exist? And the wonderful thing is that what this analysis of the Nation Brands Index told me is that I no longer have, nobody else has to go to leaders of countries and beg them to behave better, beg them to contribute more to poverty reduction or stamping out inequality or slowing down climate change or not exporting their garbage to other countries where it gets dumped in the sea. We no longer have to say to them, do this because it's the right thing to do this because you'll go to heaven. We can say it to them with an argument of narrow, direct, immediate economic self-interest. We can say to them, look, the reason why you need to tackle climate change, the reason you need to curb emissions, the reason you need to do this, that, and the other thing is because your country's reputation depends on it. If you do the right thing for humanity and the planet, I promise you, I guarantee that within a certain amount of time, that will be reflected in a more powerful and a more positive national image. And that, within a certain amount of time, will directly deliver you concrete, short-term economic benefits. It will boost your tourism. It will boost your trade. It will boost your foreign investment levels. It will boost everything. So doing well and doing good are the same thing. And doing the right thing is the thing that will cause most countries to develop most quickly and to do better for their own citizens as well as for everybody else. So the conclusion of all of this is that things aren't so bad after all. There are certain inherent mechanisms in the way that the international community works, which actually argue for us to support and preserve the whole of humanity and the whole of the planet. It's actually a natural system that if we pursue it, things will go better for all of us collectively and for all of our countries individually. And that is a really, really exciting discovery. And that, bang on, is 30 minutes. So I'll stop and I'll let Jamie ask me some questions if she still has some.
Wow. I always love hearing you speak, Simon. It's an inspiration, and you are always ending on such a positive point. But I want to go back to some of these global problems. That's our program is built here at OSU, our Master's in Global Studies around solving global problems. So if you had to prioritize your list of global problems, you mentioned a few. Which are the most pressing? What do we tackle first?
Well, I don't think we've got any choice in the matter. We have to tackle the pandemic first. But I think that that's not a bad thing, because in many ways, if this doesn't sound too heartless, I think the pandemic has actually been incredibly useful and continues to be incredibly useful for a number of reasons, really. First of all, I think the pandemic has been very good for that all-important sense of collective being. The realization that we are all part of the same species inhabiting the same planet. Because everybody who's got any access to TV, radio, internet, or whatever, for the last year, they've seen in front of on their screens every single evening, this extraordinary, petrifying spectacle of everybody throughout the entire planet suffering like they do, grieving like they do, worried like they do. And at the end of that, you cannot but have a stronger feeling that we are truly one species inhabiting one planet. And I think that's going to make the communications battle for climate change a whole lot more productive in the future. Because part of the problem with climate change was that it was very difficult to get people feeling that we were all in one boat together. And the pandemic has done that for us. The other thing that it's done, I think, is that in a grim kind of way, it's proved to us that we human beings have no special dispensation to survive. This tiny invisible virus could knock us out from one day to the next, and that's pretty obvious. We're really struggling at the moment. And that, I think, is also important, because part of the problem with the arguments over climate change was that most of humanity was behaving like stroppy adolescents who believe that they're immortal. And we just never really thought that climate change was ever going to be much of a problem for many of us. And we thought to ourselves, hell, the scientists will fix it. We'll get through it somehow. Now, suddenly, we've been presented with the possibility of our immediate eradication. And that has taught us a little humility, which I think we urgently needed. So that's a funny kind of answer to your question, Jamie, but I think the point that I'm making is that they are all linked. And the pandemic and climate change have got to be top of the list. But there are many, many others at the same time. I mean, migration is a continuous and constant dilemma. This is why I insist all of the time on the interconnectedness between these challenges, because if we look at the underlying causes, as I said just in the last half hour or so, about the culture of governance, the degree to which countries are effective at working together, if we can try and solve the underlying issues, then we may just find that we're solving so many of these global issues simultaneously. We're actually creating an environment where it's easier to fix them and where some of them may even start to fix themselves. So we've got to do them all at the same time, and we have to do that by going at the underpinning issues.
Thank you. Okay, my next question is also a bit selfish, and it has to do with the United States and our international reputation. So, after the election we just endured, and of course the horrible attack on the U.S. Capitol, how can the United States restore our reputation and our international standing? We were once the model of democracy, and now I feel like we no longer have the moral authority.
I don't think it's going to be all that difficult. I think it's partly because humanity is, on the whole, according to my research, very used to admiring the US and looking up to it in many different ways. And it's difficult and not pleasant for them to drop that feeling forever. See, one of the things I've learned about national image over the years is that the key question, the key topic here, is not whether people like you as a country or don't like you. The really key question is whether they want to like you or they don't want to like you, right? So if you're a country that people just don't want to like, then it hardly matters what you do or what you say, they're going to resist it. And if you do good things, they're going to ascribe negative motivations to your behavior. If you're a country that people don't want to like, and you start giving away billions of dollars to aid to poverty relief in developing countries, people are going to look at that and say, nah, they're just trying to impress us, or they're just trying to buy our friendship, because they don't want to like you. They do want to like America because it's such an ingrained habit. And America, as the international guarantor of the multilateral system, as the reliable bedrock of modern democracy, it's not true for everybody by any means, and there are a lot of people it's never been true for, but it's true for an awful lot of people. And a lot of people want America back so badly that they're going to do most of Joe Biden's work for him. In fact, I suspect that in just the same way that the US image recovered from the slightly negative associations following the invasion of Iraq and the second term of George W. Bush, the moment Obama stepped into the White House, America's image shot from seventh place, where it had languished since Bush 2, up to first, and then it stayed there. At the moment, it's even further down. It's 10th or something like that. My guess is that the next time we run the Nation Brands Index, which sadly won't be until August or September, we'll probably find that it's gone back up to first or very nearly first again, just because people will say, it's okay, we don't have to worry about America anymore, the right guy is in charge. Whether he is the right guy or not, who knows? But they just, they're hearing those all-important, critical, reassuring noises about we're back on your side again. We're on the team of multilateralism and cooperation, and you can trust us again. And I think the desire to do so is so strong that people just will.
Well, that makes me feel better. We'll
I
watch.
may be wrong.
Yeah. Well, we will be watching. I have a question that came in from a student, I believe, and it says, you mentioned rich countries and poor countries. What about rich countries with poor people?
Oh, all rich countries have got poor people, and all poor countries have got rich people. Inequality, as we know, within countries and between countries, is, if you like, the engine of an enormous amount of the turmoil and upheaval that we see all around us. Um, there was a marvelous book written several years ago by two British sociologists called The Spirit Level, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Jamie. And it argued that basically inequality within countries was the primary driver of most of those countries' problems, including problems which seem to have very little to do with each other. And the reason why, for example, the United States suffers from very, very similar social problems to, say, Nigeria, even though they've got very, very different levels of GDP, is because they have very similar levels of inequality. And that, as pretty much every politician knows, is the thing that you need to try to sort out if you're going to have a stable and peaceful society.
Okay, interesting. In the book, you talk about living in Mexico for a
Hmm.
time, and I know we have a lot of Mexican students. So tell us, where does Mexico rank as a good country?
I don't know off the top of my head. I can take a quick look and I can tell you in the latest edition, 75th out of 150, 160 countries. And its top ranking, it has three high rankings, relatively high rankings. One is its contribution to global health and well-being, which is 64th. Mexico is justly renowned as being a good member of the World Health Organization and a very effective partner when there's a pandemic going. Prosperity and equality, 64th, because it's such an important trading partner to North America. Planet and climate, 66th. Mexico does better on average on its contribution to planet and climate than its overall score would suggest. So in many areas, Mexico does actually contribute more to the planet, perhaps than many people believe. I lived and worked in Mexico. I had the privilege and the pleasure of living there for nearly a year, and I was advising President Felipe Calderon when he was in office, and I got to know Mexico a little bit. And one of the things I discovered is that Mexico is perhaps the best example I've ever come across of a country with a reputation that is genuinely less good than it deserves. And I'm afraid that part of the reason for that is because of the United States of America. That the USA, over the centuries, has, for various reasons connected with its own self-image more than anything else, has purveyed an image of Mexico to the world which is very negative. Through Hollywood, through popular culture, through the news media, and in many, many different ways. Powerful countries often do this to weaker countries. They brand them negatively, sometimes to make themselves feel more important. My country, England, has been doing that to Ireland for the last 300 years. Spain does it a bit to Portugal. Sweden does it a bit to Finland. Countries do this. It's not pretty, but the richer of a pair of countries, the more powerful of a pair of countries, often tries to make the weaker look even weaker because it makes them feel better about themselves. And Mexico's misfortune, to misquote Porfirio Diaz, is that it lives next door to the country with the loudest voice on the planet. And so every time America has a nightmare about Mexico, the whole world hears about it. And this is a great shame because Mexico, as we all know, is a very, very, very strong country to bet on for the future for all kinds of reasons. And yet the story that the world hears about Mexico is trivial at best and negative at worst, which is not to say that Mexico doesn't have problems. My God, it has problems. But the competence with which it generally tackles those problems and just the quality of the people and the quality of the way that it's governed, its civil service rather than its politicians, is excellent. And it genuinely does deserve a better reputation than it has. People seem to know almost nothing of its extraordinary landscapes, just for starters. And it has to spend 4 times as much on tourism promotion just so that people know how extraordinarily beautiful it is. So Mexico is a country that is very, very badly in need of being better understood by the rest of the world.
Okay. I love Mexico. I have spent a lot of time there, and I love the people and our students from Mexico. So I had another question, presumably from a student. It says, is the good country label biased toward Occidental countries? Is it fair to hold a lower income non-Western country to the same standards of good that the Western countries? Uh,
That's such an important question. So let me try to tackle it as completely as I can. First of all, in the Good Country Index, the ranking, I do my best to ensure that it's not biased by the economic size of the country. And we do that very simply by just dividing each country's scores by its GDP. We tried doing it by population, we tried doing it by GNI, we tried doing it in various ways. It didn't make a lot of difference. If you divide the country's scores by the size of its economy, then you create a more level playing field. And you're not giving the big rich countries an unfair advantage. So what the Good Country Index is measuring is how much good each country does outside its border per dollar of GDP relative to the size of its economy. So in the simple context of the index itself, we're able to eliminate that factor to a considerable degree. However, the fact remains that the top ranking countries are almost always Western, wealthy, post-industrial democracies. In fact, they're nearly always members of the European Union. And of course, predictably, I get hundreds of furious emails from people accusing me of cooking up the whole thing just in order to try and make Europe look better. Why would I want to do that? My country's just left Europe. But anyway, it's not anything deliberate. But it is a question that has to be asked. Why is it that European countries always rank so much better in terms of their goodity? And why is it that poorer countries like, for example, Kenya, ranking in the top levels of the index, are a relative rarity? It shouldn't be anything to do with money for the reasons that I've given. A, because only a handful of the 35 indicators are anything to do with money, and B, because we divide by GDP anyway, and yet there's still richer countries on top. Now, I think, to be perfectly honest, the reason why so many European Union countries end up on top is because the European Union is pretty much the only case in history where a bunch of countries have got together and cooperated and collaborated fairly fully for the purpose of their collective well-being, their collective security, and their collective peace and stability. And it has worked. The European Union is an experiment that's been remarkably successful. So EU member states know from personal experience, from personal benefit, about the advantages of cooperating, collaborating, working together with other countries, tearing down boundaries, building bridges rather than walls, eliminating tariffs, having a customs union, all of that kind of stuff. They know it works because they've experienced it for the last 40 years. And the Nordic countries, who feature very prominently at the top of the index, particularly because the Nordic region is a particularly cooperative and it's a region with a cooperative and collaborative tradition within Europe, which is itself a cooperative and collaborative region. That's the reason why the EU countries tend to come top. A question which has to be asked, however, is to what extent are these advantages still structural? Because bear in mind that some, although by no means all, of the countries that rank high in the Good Country Index are also countries that in the past have wielded colonial power. And to what extent is that advantage something that has been built into them as a result of their conquering other countries in the past? And the answer is to some degree. My colleagues and I published a decolonized version of the Good Country Index, just really out of curiosity to see how different it would be if one tried to eliminate the longer term economic and power advantages that countries get from having run an international empire in the past. And it does change some of the rankings, but not all that much. In the end, the advantages do seem to be a snapshot in time. No matter what point in time you look at them, they're there. And I think it's more to do with the modern behavior of countries than the past behavior. But that's an open question and one that I'm always happy to carry on discussing.
Very good. Well, we're about to run out of time, I think, but I do have one last question. First of all, I want to recommend the book. I'm going to hold it up one more time. It's a really good read. And the great thing about reading your book, Simon, is you talk about super hard stuff in a really easy to understand, entertaining almost way. And so I definitely say this about this book. And I recommend it to everybody out there. So in the book, you talk a lot about the Good Country Index, but then you also talk about the good generation. And I kind of wanted to leave on a positive note. Tell us what we can do. What can we do as individuals to make things gooder?
Well, you're already doing it because you're in education. And I said right at the beginning of my little talk that there are really only two things wrong with the world. The first one is the way that countries behave, and the second one is the way that people behave. You say that and you said everything and you've said nothing. But the way that people behave is, as I said, the cause. You look at all of those grand challenges, they're all caused by human behavior. And therefore, if you want to change the world, you have to change humanity. And if you want to change humanity, there's only one way to do that, really, and that's through education. Because changing the way that adults behave is enormously difficult. Once people get past the age of about 30, they get so set in their ways and so convinced that their worldview is the only one. And we just seem to spend all of our lives after the age of about 30 just working on entrenching and fortifying our worldview so that we never have to challenge it ever again. Children, on the other hand, it's incredibly easy to mold children's minds when they're still at school. It's terrifyingly easy. And that's why education is quite rightly carefully ring-fenced against interference from outside. But the fact remains that if you really, really, really wanted to fix all the grand challenges, from climate change down to small arms proliferation in one go, then the way you do that is by changing humanity, and the way you change humanity is through education. So the project that I'm spending most of my time on at the moment is one I call the Good Generation. And that is a plan for the whole world to agree on a limited set of virtues, values, and skill sets that we all agree we want all of our children to learn when they're at school, wherever they are in the world. And so the way that it works is this. We produce a kind of draft of what those basic values or virtues might be, with a huge amount of research looking into different countries all over the world, different religions, different historical traditions, and we come up with a draft. We've done that already. So we've got a draft now of about 7 skill sets, fundamental skill sets, things like critical thinking, and 8, if you like, values and virtues, which include things like stewardship, feeling a sense of responsibility for the nature around you. And each of those is potentially a vaccine for one of the grand challenges. The way I often phrase this project is by saying, look, we have the vaccine for the pandemic, but where's the vaccine for climate change? Where's the vaccine for terrorism? Where's the vaccine for inequality and species loss? Well, we have the vaccine for all of them. It's called education. And it's been very, very thoroughly tested over centuries. But just like the vaccine for COVID, the problem with the vaccine of education is that it's not properly distributed. And distribution is the challenge. We have to basically create a whole generation of Greta Thunbergs or Malalas. We have to try and get education about the grand challenges and those sets of values and virtues instilled into every child in time for the next generation, so that an entire generation, when it leaves school, will be running towards the grand challenges instead of running away from them, which is what our generations have done. So the Good Generation starts with a big online global conversation where we get children and parents and teachers from every country on earth to have a big artificial intelligence moderated conversation. You can do this with AI, where we basically debate and discuss for as long as it takes what's that basic set of values and virtues and principles that we want all the kids to learn. And then having done that, we write it into a universal global charter of educational values. Now, people will often say, and then we get all the ministers of education in the world to sign up to it. A lot of people at this point say, yeah, this is a lovely idea, but it'll be impossible to get all of those different countries with their different religions, their different histories, their different traditions, their different cultures to agree on something as sensitive as the education of children. You know, good luck with it. You just won't succeed. And I always say to people who say that, you know, you should really go back and have another look at a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And while you're about it, check out something called the UN Charter. Yeah, 1946 and 1948, I think, if I've got the dates right. Those are 2 of the finest documents ever written by any human being. they are deeply profound and deeply touching, and they are a sign that when humanity really needs to get its act together because things are really, really bad and really threatening, we can do it. We've done it before. Human rights is even more sensitive than the education of children. If we've done it before, we can do it again, and that's what I'm banking on right now.
Wow. Thank you, Simon. I appreciate so much your being here. Um, I just feel really honored that you took your time because I know it is very precious and it's late in London. I would say it's time to go to the pub, but I don't think the pubs are open right now. So we were very lucky to have you with us uh, this afternoon.
It was a real pleasure.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that next month's virtual Global Briefing series will feature Jed Willard. He's the director of the FDR Foundation at Harvard University. And his talk called Truth, Fiction, and Lies in the New Media Environment, the Existential Struggle for Global Democracies will be held live on O State TV at 5 p.m. on March 17th. So hopefully we will be without glitches, and you all will be back here to watch Jed Willard. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our co-sponsors, UPIEP and Phi Beta Delta, and thank you to O State TV. Bye-bye.